inside their ocean in 1974.
Right.
Let's do it.
Single Susanna.
Who?
All right?
You have to sing yes.
All right. Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. I come from Alabama with a banjo on my knee. It rains so hard.
Mommy!
You know, I've had the image of my mom in my head since I'm 5, and it won't go away until I die.
Authorities say they now know who killed the mother of 3, Thomas Generazio, a sanitation worker from Oceanside. He died in 2004.
He is 57 years old. He is standing at a podium at the Nassau County Police Department in Mineola, New York. Cameras are rolling. FBI agents are seated behind him. His sister is standing to his left. His brother is standing to his right. And the 3 of them, these 3 people in their late 50s who were once 5 and 6 and 7 years old, are about to say publicly what they have been waiting 52 years to say. He steps to the microphone, the room goes quiet, and then he says the sentence he has been carrying since the afternoon he stepped off a kindergarten bus in Oceanside, Long Island, and walked through the front door of his family home and found something that a 5-year-old mind was never built to hold. 8 words. No drama, no tears, no performance. Just a man stating a fact he has long since stopped fighting. I've had the image of my mom in my head since I'm 5, and it won't go away until I die. The room stays quiet, because there is nothing to say after that. There is no response adequate to 8 words that carry 52 years of a wound that was open before he had lost his baby teeth and never once closed. Not through childhood, not through adolescence, not through adulthood, not through the raising of his own children, not through the death of his father, not through the press conference he is standing at right now. That sentence is where this story ends. Now let me take you to where it begins. Go back with him, back past the press conferences and the DNA laboratories and the 52 years of silence. Back past the false confessions and the cleared suspects and the composite sketch that sat in a file for 5 decades. Or back past the sealed cardboard box sitting in a Nassau County evidence storage facility with a blue bathrobe inside it that was waiting with the patience that only inanimate things can sustain, for a science that had not yet been invented, and a laboratory in Texas that had not yet been built. Back to January 11th, 1974. Back to a street called Sally Lane in Oceanside, Long Island, where the morning was cold and gray, and the kind of ordinary that does not announce itself as the last ordinary morning a family will ever have, because those mornings never do. There is a colonial 2-story house at the 3900 block of that street. There is a dentist who has just left for work. There are 3 children who have just left for school. There is a woman in a blue bathrobe standing alone in the kitchen with no reason in the world to be afraid. And somewhere on those same streets, less than 4 miles away, a 26-year-old man is already moving through the morning. He knows these streets. He has driven them. He may have stood at the end of that very driveway and done the most unremarkable job in the world and watched the rhythms of that household from the most invisible vantage point imaginable. No one will connect him to what happens next for 52 years. Stay with us. Because this case, the details, the evidence, the person responsible, and the community that lived next to him without ever knowing, is one of the most extraordinary cold case resolutions in the history of New York law enforcement. And it starts the way all of them start, with a morning that felt like every other morning. Oceanside in January sits quiet in the way that only Long Island suburbs sit quiet in winter. The cold comes in off the Atlantic and settles over the streets and stays. The colonial homes with their driveways and their station wagons look the same from the outside in every season. The difference in January is the stillness. The way a neighborhood holds its breath before the day decides what it is going to be. This was Nassau County in 1974, a hamlet on Long Island where families had been neighbors long enough that they stopped knocking before they came through the back door, where the word community still meant something tangible, a shared responsibility, a looking out for each other that did not need to be discussed because it was simply understood. The house at the 3900 block of Sally Lane looked exactly like every other house on every other street in Oceanside, Long Island that morning. It was not. Oceanside in 1974 was a portrait of American suburban life, so familiar it almost felt scripted. Streets lined with colonial homes, driveways with station wagons, children who went to the same schools their parents had gone to, families who had been neighbors long enough that they stopped knocking before they came through the back door. It was the kind of place where the word community still meant something tangible, a shared responsibility, a looking out for each other that did not need to be discussed because it was simply understood. It was also the kind of place where any deviation from the ordinary registered. A light on too late, a car that should not be in a driveway, a silence where there was usually sound. Oceanside in 1974 was a neighborhood that noticed things, which made what was about to happen on Sally Lane and the fact that it would go unanswered for 52 years all the more devastating. And on the 3900 block of Sally Lane in Oceanside lived a family that this community had taken quietly and completely to heart. The house at the 3900 block of Sally Lane belonged to Jerry and Barbara Waldman. Jerry was a dentist, local, well-liked. The kind of man people in Oceanside described as steady, that word that communities reach for when they mean reliable, present, the kind of person who shows up and keeps showing up without requiring credit for it. He had a dental practice in Oceanside, and he went to it every weekday morning, and he came home every evening, and in between those departures and arrivals, the house on Sally Lane was alive. 3 children lived in that house: Marla, who was 7, Larry, who was 6, and Eric, who had just turned 5. They were the kind of children whose noise was the signature of a home that was genuinely inhabited by people who wanted to be in it. The neighbors on Sally Lane knew this house not from its exterior, but from its sounds, the voices carrying through the windows, the low, warm hum of a household in motion, and at the center of that house, at the center of everything that made it feel the way a home is supposed to feel, was Barbara. Barbara Waldman was 31 years old. She had long blonde hair and a laugh that made everyone in the room feel like they were in on the joke. The neighbors on Sally Lane knew the sound of that laugh through an open window on a summer afternoon. They knew that the house at the 3900 block was warm in a way that went beyond the thermostat. They knew it from the sounds that came out of it, and the way the children moved through the street, and the way Barbara moved through a neighborhood gathering. Always present, always genuinely there, not the kind of presence that performs warmth, but the kind that simply has it. She was an NYU graduate, not a small thing for a woman of her generation. The degree said something specific about who she was and what she had decided to do with her time and her intelligence and the life that had been given to her to build. She was always singing, always moving, the kind of mother who got down on the floor with her children, not because she felt obligated to, but because she genuinely wanted to. She volunteered with the Oceanside Cancer Society. She showed up for her neighbors. She was active in the community in a way that was not performative. She believed that being part of something larger than your own household mattered, not as a philosophy she had arrived at intellectually, but as something she demonstrated in the specific and daily texture of how she lived. Investigators would later describe her as a vibrant woman with long blonde hair, well-liked in the neighborhood, active in the Oceanside Cancer Society. That is accurate, and it is also insufficient. And the people who actually knew her did not describe her in those terms because those terms do not carry what they needed to carry. They described the laugh, the floor, the open window, the warmth that was not a function of the thermostat. On the morning of January 11th, 1974, Barbara had gotten 3 children under 8 years old out the door. Backpacks, breakfast, the minor organized chaos of a family in motion when nobody wants to put their coat on and the bus is not going to wait. Marla, Larry, Eric on his kindergarten school bus, a half-day student, home before the others. She was wearing a nightgown and a blue bathrobe. A quiet morning, a slow one, the kind where you have gotten everyone out the door and allowed yourself the brief and ordinary luxury of not rushing. She had no reason to be afraid. Somewhere on those same streets, less than 4 miles from the house on Sally Lane, someone else was already moving through that same morning. And he knew this neighborhood better than most people knew their own driveway. The morning of January 11th, 1974, unfolded at the Waldman house on Sally Lane, the way weekday mornings unfold in houses with 3 young children, in layers, in stages, in the small accumulated urgencies of getting everyone where they need to be before the day begins without them. Marla left first, 7 years old, already carrying the particular confidence of an eldest child who knows the routine better than anyone. Larry followed, 6 years old, a year behind his sister, moving through the morning at his own pace. Eric climbed onto the kindergarten school bus. He was a half-day student. He would be home before the others. He would be home before anyone expected him. Jerry left for his dental practice in Oceanside, the same practice he went to every weekday, the same route, the same departure that a husband and father makes on a morning that has given him no reason to hesitate at the door. And then Barbara Waldman was alone in the house on Sally Lane. She was wearing her nightgown and her blue bathrobe. A quiet morning, a slow one. The particular hum of a home with someone in it, that low, constant presence, was still there. And then someone came to the door. Somewhere on those same streets, a 26-year-old man was already moving through the morning. He worked sanitation in Oceanside. And he knew these streets the way only a person who drives them every day for a living knows them, not as landmarks or addresses, but as a rhythm, a sequence, a set of turns the body makes without instruction. Nassau County Police would later note carefully, and without confirming that it was possible, this man had at some point been the Waldman family's own garbage collector, that he may have stood at the end of their driveway on Sally Lane, done the most unremarkable job in the world, and watched the rhythms of that household from the most invisible vantage point imaginable. He lived fewer than 4 miles from the house on Sally Lane. No one noticed him on the streets of Oceanside that morning. No one had any reason to. He was exactly where a sanitation worker in this neighborhood was supposed to be. Invisible, ordinary, completely unremarkable. That was the point. And it was exactly why no one looked twice when he was there. Barbara Waldman was found inside her residence on Sally Lane in Oceanside around 9 in the morning on January 11th, 1974. That is the clinical fact. That is what the Nassau County Police Department record states. What the record does not state, what no record can state, is what the house looked like from the outside when the last ordinary thing that would ever happen inside it was still happening. From the street, it looked exactly like what it was. A colonial 2-story house on a quiet block in Oceanside, Long Island. A dentist's home, a family home. Nothing about it, not the driveway, not the front door, not the windows, suggested that anything had changed since Jerry had left for work or the children had left for school. The house did not announce what had happened inside it. That detail would matter enormously later. Jerry Waldman was called from his dental practice in Oceanside that morning. He came home to a house full of Nassau County police and an absence where his wife had been when he left. And sometime in the chaos of that afternoon, with police moving through the rooms and neighbors gathering at the edges of the yard in that particular way neighbors gather when something unspeakable has happened on their street, he found the words. He gathered all 3 children, Marla, age 7, Larry, age 6, and Eric, who was 5 years old and had already seen something that no 5-year-old should ever see, and was already carrying something that no 5-year-old should carry. He told them a bad man had come into the house. He told them their mom was in heaven. He told them she wasn't coming home. Marla would recall those exact words more than 50 years later with perfect clarity. Not because they were perfect words, but because they were the last sentence of the life the Waldman children had known, and the first sentence of the life they would now have to build without her. And sometime that morning, the house at the 3900 block of Sally Lane became a crime scene. And at midday, a 5-year-old boy stepped off a kindergarten school bus in Oceanside, Long Island, and walked toward home. There are things a 5-year-old brain cannot process all at once, not because the child is not intelligent, but because the human mind at any age was not built to absorb certain things without warning. It slows down the intake of information that has no frame of reference, on no category, no place to go. Eric Waldman was a half-day kindergarten student. He stepped off his school bus sometime around midday and walked toward the house on Sally Lane the way he had walked toward it every day of his short life. The front door, the steps, the smell of home, everything exactly where it was supposed to be. Except it wasn't. Inside the house was wrong in a way Eric couldn't name. The TV was off when it shouldn't have been. The kitchen was empty. The particular hum of a home with someone in it, that low constant presence that children feel without knowing they feel it, was gone. He moved through the first floor, then toward the stairs, the second floor hallway, the door to his parents' bedroom. And there, in the flash of blue from his mother's bathrobe, the world ended for him. Barbara Waldman was lying face down on the floor next to her bed. Her hands were bound behind her back with her own stockings. She had been shot. She was 31 years old. The Nassau County Police Department arrived and classified what they found as a deliberate and intentional act, a homicide. The quiet street outside began filling with police vehicles, and the investigation that would take 52 years to close had just begun. The Nassau County Police Department investigators documented what they found at the scene on Sally Lane with the tools available to them in 1974. Barbara had been found face down on the floor of the second-floor master bedroom next to her bed, her hands bound behind her back with her own stockings. She had been shot once in the head. The house had not been ransacked. There was no broken glass, no overturned furniture. I'd no evidence of a struggle that extended beyond that one room. The violence had been contained, deliberate, purposeful. Investigators recovered a biological sample from Barbara's blue bathrobe. They sealed it and filed it. They recovered a fingerprint from within the residence. They sealed it and filed it. Neighbors on Sally Lane reported seeing a man moving quickly away from the house that morning, conspicuous enough to register, not conspicuous enough to stop. From those accounts, a composite sketch was drawn. A face, a general build, something to work from. But 1974 was 1974. Commissioner Patrick Ryder would say it plainly 52 years later from a podium in Mineola. The problem was, back then, we had no DNA. The biological sample couldn't be tested. The fingerprint couldn't be matched. The sketch was just a drawing. Somewhere in a Nassau County evidence storage facility, a blue bathrobe was sealed into a cardboard box. It would sit there for 50 years. The evidence existed. The science to read it did not. Not yet. In the absence of an arrest, the mind of a community reaches for an explanation closer to home, something that fits inside the frame of what people already know, something that restores the feeling that violence has logic, that it doesn't just walk in off the street without reason, that there is an explanation available, one that makes the world feel less randomly dangerous than the alternative. And so the whispers began in Oceanside. Not loudly. They never do. They move through the neighborhood the way rumors always move, sideways, in the spaces between conversations, in hesitations before a sentence. in looks exchanged across a room that said everything without saying anything at all. Jerry Waldman had not been home. His wife was dead. That, for some people, was enough. Jerry Waldman did not run. He did not leave Oceanside. He went back to his dental practice. He raised Marla, Larry, and Eric. His daughter Marla would later say that her dad, being who he was, had to be strong for his children, never ran from rumors. He continued to work, live, raise his family, and become a well-loved member of the Oceanside community. As children, we heard many times that people were suspicious of my father, and that he may have had something to do with my mom's murder. So this powerful social mark of disgrace was heavy and hurtful to our family. But dignity does not silence rumors, and the children heard them, all three of them, for the rest of their childhood and well into their adult lives. Marla, Larry, and Eric Waldman grew up in Oceanside inside a particular kind of absence, one that had no name and no resolution, and therefore no place to land. Barbara's pictures came down off the walls, packed away, not displayed. The family did not talk about what had happened because there was no language adequate to the conversation and no resolution to give it a place to end. They grew up hearing periodically that some people suspected their father. Of that cruelty, the suggestion that the only parent they had left was somehow responsible for the void at the center of their lives proved to be one of the most lasting injuries the case inflicted on this family. Not the only one, but one of the deepest. Larry would say it at a press conference in Mineola 52 years later with the quiet weight of someone reporting a fact that had been true for their entire adult life and had never once stopped being true regardless of what else happened around it. We have been hurting for a really long time. And Eric? The 5-year-old who had stepped off a kindergarten school bus and walked through the first floor and up the stairs and opened a door, carried something specific, an image, something that would not leave him for the next 52 years. Made a few blocks away from Sally Lane, Thomas Generazio was still alive, still living in Oceanside, still moving through the same streets where he had committed the crime, and no one, not the police, not the family, not a single neighbor, knew his name. The investigation moved forward on its available tools. Leads were followed. Months became years. No arrest came. And then the false hopes began. At some point in the years that followed, a man serving time in prison came forward with a confession. He claimed responsibility for Barbara Waldman's death. For a family that had spent years waiting for exactly this kind of break, that confession must have felt like the beginning of the end of the waiting. DNA testing proved it false. The man had never been on Sally Lane. Then investigators turned their attention to a 1968 homicide in Valley Stream, a community in Nassau County not far from Oceanside, whose circumstances bore enough similarity to the Waldman case that a connection seemed worth pursuing. Perhaps the same offender, perhaps a pattern. DNA testing ruled that out too. Nassau County detectives formally submitted a DNA sample from Jerry Waldman for testing. He was excluded, completely, unambiguously. The biological evidence from the Sally Lane crime scene did not match Jerry Waldman. The science said clearly and permanently what his children had always known. Their father was innocent. Jerry Waldman died in 2006. He never knew who killed his wife on Sally Lane. He went to his grave carrying the weight of 3 decades of community suspicion alongside his grief. The 2 burdens that should never have been his to carry at all. As his son Larry said at the press conference 20 years after his father's death, "It is vindication for my father, Jerry Waldman, who went to his deathbed not really knowing who or what. But some evidence does not expire." In a Nassau County storage facility, a blue bathrobe was sitting in a sealed cardboard box. It had been waiting 30 years already. It would wait a little longer. Somewhere in a Nassau County evidence storage facility, a blue bathrobe sat inside a sealed cardboard box. It waited through all of it. Through the end of the Cold War, through the invention of the internet, and the placing of it in everyone's pocket, through the sequencing of the human genome, or through the building of ancestry databases containing the DNA of millions of ordinary people, databases built by companies whose founders had not yet been born on January 11th, 1974. It waited while Thomas Generazio continued to live in Oceanside, continued to work, continued to move through the same streets where he had committed the crime, and the Waldman children had grown up in the wreckage of what he had done. It waited for a science that had not yet been invented, for a laboratory in the woodlands, Texas, that had not yet been built, for a match that had not yet been made. The match was coming, and so was the name. Before we continue, every case on Condemned Files is the result of careful research, fact verification, and respectful reconstruction of real events. We do not rush these stories, because accuracy is not optional when real lives are involved. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe right now and leave a comment telling us which detail from today's case stayed with you the longest. Your engagement is what keeps these files open. Now, back to the case. Nassau County never stopped. At the urging of the Waldman family, investigators continued DNA testing across the years. With FBI assistance, the Nassau County Police Department Homicide Squad, the Nassau County District Attorney's Office, and the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner submitted forensic evidence to Othram, a private forensic genetics laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, built specifically to extract usable genetic information from evidence that conventional methods had failed on. What Othram developed from the biological sample on Barbara's blue bathrobe was something that had previously been impossible: a full comprehensive DNA profile of the unknown contributor, not partial, not incomplete. A complete genetic identity belonging to the man who had been in that bedroom more than 4 decades earlier. They had him. They just didn't know who he was yet. The principle of what came next is elegant in its logic. You do not need to find the exact person. You need to find someone related to them, a cousin, a second cousin, someone who shares enough genetic material that investigators can begin building a family tree, and then by working forward and backward through generations of public records, narrow that tree until only one person could be the source of the original sample. Chime in August 2024, confirmed by Commissioner Ryder at the press conference in Mineola. A light DNA match surfaced. Not a direct hit, not a name, just a signal. A partial alignment between the profile from Barbara's bathrobe and the DNA of someone in a genealogy database. A thread, the beginning of a trail. FBI forensic genealogists began constructing family trees from that partial match, interviewing relatives, mapping connections, cross-referencing names against public records, property records, employment records, death certificates, working backward through decades, eliminating branches, narrowing slowly and then quickly toward a single point of origin. This was the 19th publicly announced case in the state of New York where officials leveraged Othram's identity inference pipeline. The 19th family who had spent decades waiting. The 19th thread pulled all the way back to a crime that had seemed permanently cold. That single point of origin had a name, and it was a name that had been in Oceanside, Long Island the entire time. Thomas Generazio. Born February 1st, 1947. Oceanside, New York. Not a neighboring town, not a different county. Oceanside, the same community where Barbara Waldman had lived and died. A few blocks from the house on Sally Lane. He worked sanitation in Oceanside. He had driven those streets professionally, been a routine and invisible presence in that neighborhood for years, moved through the community in a role so ordinary that no one would have thought twice about seeing him there. The Nassau County Police noted carefully, without confirming, that it was possible Generazio had at some point been the Waldman family's own garbage collector. that he may have stood at the end of their driveway on Sally Lane and done the most unremarkable job in the world and watched the rhythms of that household from the most invisible vantage point imaginable. He had been arrested twice, once for assault, once for possession of stolen property. 2 encounters with law enforcement that in a different era would have placed his DNA into a system that would have matched the bathrobe evidence decades earlier. But in the years those arrests occurred, DNA collection was not standard practice. His genetic profile had never entered any system. He had never been a suspect. He had never been questioned. The composite sketch drawn in 1974 from the accounts of neighbors who had seen a man near the Waldman home that morning was described by Commissioner Ryder at the press conference in Mineola as almost a perfect match to Thomas Generazio. He had been in the data all along, in the sketch, in the neighborhood, in the evidence sitting in a cardboard box in a Nassau County storage facility.
Police in Nassau County announced that DNA evidence has linked them to the man behind the 1974 murder of Barbara Waldman.
She was just 31 years old. Eyewitness News reporter Crystal Cranmore talked to Waldman's family and has more on the man investigated.
Thomas Generazio died of cancer in 2004 at the age of 57. He had lived out the remainder of his life in Oceanside, in the same community where he had committed the crime, in the same streets where the Waldman children had grown up in the wreckage of what he had done. He had never been charged, never questioned, never forced to account for a single moment of January 11th, 1974. His family cooperated with the investigation when investigators came to them. They had not known. Marla Waldman Kahn would say the thing that contained the specific shock of all of it in a single sentence. He was a local. He was literally living among us. I was shocked. Then came the phone call, the one that Marla had spent 50 years half expecting and half convinced would never actually come. It was not a press conference, not a formal announcement, just a phone call, the kind that Marla Waldman had spent 50 years half expecting and half convinced would never actually come. There was a pause, and then 4 words that collapsed 5 decades of waiting into a single moment. We have a match. Marla fell to the floor, not figuratively, not as an expression. Her legs gave out beneath her, the way they do when the body receives information that the mind has been bracing against for so long that the sudden release of that tension has nowhere to go except down. She flew to New York. She sat across from investigators and heard for the first time a complete account of who Thomas Generazio was. A sanitation worker, born 1947, Oceanside, a few blocks away. She had never heard his name in her life. There was no buried memory of a face or a voice or an encounter that rearranged itself into something sinister. He was simply a stranger who had entered their home on Sally Lane, destroyed their family, and returned to his ordinary life in Oceanside and lived it out to its conclusion while the Waldman children spent their entire adulthoods in the wreckage of what he had done. On March 11th, 2026, Nassau County Police Commissioner Patrick Ryder stood at a podium at the Nassau County Police Department in Mineola, New York, and beside him stood 3 adults in their late 50s who had once been 5, 6, and 7 years old when their world collapsed on Sally Lane. Commissioner Patrick Ryder did not speak in careful language. An individual that we now know to be Thomas Generazio entered that residence and committed a violent sexual assault against the mother and then put a bullet in the back of her head as she lay on the floor tied up with the stockings that she was wearing. We would have liked to have seen him in jail for that entire time for the brutal murder that he did. He said the word brutal with the weight of a man who had spent a career in law enforcement and still could not make peace with the fact that some people who commit monstrous acts never face consequences for them. Generazio had not spent a single day in a cell, not one. He had died in 2004 in the same community where he had committed the crime, and the world had not known his name until 22 years after he was already gone. Then Marla Waldman Kahn stepped forward. She spoke about growing up with a void where their mother should have been, about the rumors that had followed their father, about the particular cruelty of watching a good man carry a stigma he had done nothing to earn for the rest of his life. As children, we heard many times that people were suspicious of my father and that he may have had something to do with my mom's murder. This powerful social mark of disgrace was heavy and hurtful to our family. My dad, being who he was, had to be strong for his children, never ran from rumors. He continued to work, live, raise his family, and become a well-loved member of the Oceanside community. Happily today, 52 years later, I get to say to the world that our father, Jerry Waldman, is exonerated. He was a victim, not a villain. Jerry Waldman died in 2006. He was not in that room. He had not lived to hear those words spoken publicly. He had gone to his grave carrying the weight of 3 decades of community suspicion alongside his grief, 2 burdens that should never have been his to carry at all. Marla said the words for him, into the record, in front of cameras, for anyone who had ever doubted. Larry spoke next. It has probably made me a better fiancé to my fiancée, and a better father to my daughter, cherishing every day, cherishing the women in my life. And it is also vindication for my father Jerry Waldman, who went to his deathbed not really knowing who or what. He said it with the quiet weight of someone who had been carrying that sentence for a very long time and was finally setting it down somewhere permanent. Although this will not bring our mother back or undo childhood traumas, it has allowed my brothers and I to achieve a sense of peace and relief. Marla said that too. In the careful, considered language of a woman who had spent a very long time thinking about what she actually needed from this moment and had arrived, after 52 years, at a precise and honest answer. And then Eric Waldman stepped to the microphone. He said very little. He didn't need to. And he had already said the thing that contained everything. I've had the image of my mom in my head since I'm 5, and it won't go away until I die. That was the true cost of January 11th, 1974. Not just a life taken, but a wound opened in a 5-year-old boy who stepped off a kindergarten school bus on a January afternoon in Oceanside and walked through the front door of the house on Sally Lane and up the stairs and found the thing that no 5-year-old should ever find, and then spent the next 52 years living with it, getting up every morning with it, raising his own children with it, standing at press conferences with it. The identification of Thomas Generazio gave Eric Waldman answers. It gave him truth. It did not give him back the image in his head. Nothing could do that. No press conference, no DNA match. A no name spoken into a microphone in Mineola could reach back to that January afternoon in 1974 and remove from the mind of a 5-year-old boy what he saw when he opened that door. After the press conference at the Nassau County Police Department in Mineola, the Waldman siblings drove to their mother's grave in Oceanside, Long Island. A detective working the case had left a card there. On it were words that felt, in the context of everything that had happened over 52 years, less like a sentiment and more like a statement of purpose. To the living we owe respect, but to the dead we owe only the truth. They placed it on the stone, and they told her it was over. Marla had already said the thing that needed to be said about what this resolution actually was and was not. The innate desire and goal of solving my mother's murder case was not about seeking legal punishment. It is an emotional and psychological resolution, a closure that allows us as a family to acknowledge that her death was a serious crime, put unresolved trauma behind us, and honor our mother's memory with a full understanding of the facts. The truth. Barbara Waldman was 31 years old. She was not a case file, not a cold case number, not a sketch on a bulletin board or a sample in an evidence bag sitting in a Nassau County storage facility waiting for a science that had not yet been invented. She was a vibrant woman with long blonde hair, well-liked in the neighborhood, active in the Oceanside Cancer Society. She was an NYU graduate. She was a devoted mother. She was the kind of person who got down on the floor with her children, not because she felt obligated to, but because she genuinely wanted to. She was a wife to Jerry, a mother to Marla, Larry, and Eric, a neighbor on Sally Lane in Oceanside, Long Island, who believed that being part of something larger than your own household mattered, and who demonstrated that belief in the specific and daily texture of how she lived. She was 31 years old, and 52 years after the morning that took her from the people who loved her most, the truth about what happened to her on Sally Lane was finally, fully, and permanently known. It arrived late, but it arrived. And for 3 children who had waited their entire lives for it, it was everything. Barbara Waldman. This was Case File 001 on Condemned Files. Barbara deserved every year she did not get. Every victim on this channel is given the same standard, told completely, accurately, and with the dignity their story deserves. If this case moved you, hit subscribe right now. New case files drop every week on Condemned Files. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one. Drop a comment below. Tell us whose file you want us to open next. The files are always open.